This lecture is about the constraints triangle that I mentioned in an earlier lecture. It's about the things that typically go wrong or change once you've developed that nice, tight, well-considered, well-thought-out work plan for your project. And yes, it happens to everyone. It even has a name, the name Constraints Triangle, and it looks like this. The constraints triangle is also sometimes called the OTOBOS triangle. That's O-T-O-B-O-S, OTOBOS. And that stands for the ideal, on target, on budget, on scope. That, of course, is what we always aim for. However, as you know as well as anyone, most projects don't unfold quite that easily. They're constrained by time, the deadline changes, you find out there's less availability of the people you need than you thought. Something related to time occurs as a constraint. Maybe you're told that the implementation project that you're doing needs to happen in February instead of July, which is what you were originally told. That's an example of a time constraint. The scope constraint up at the top refers, in this case, to what your client or your stakeholders or your funder wants you to do, to create, to deliver, versus what you're actually able to do in the end, given the kinds of constraints that you face. For instance, you might have been told that rather than training new employees on 4 subjects, they now want you to include 6 more subjects in the training. 6 subjects that all need to be developed from scratch. This is an example of a scope change. And in business circles and private sector, they sometimes call that scope creep. The third box here on the right side refers to budget. And this really more accurately should be thought of as resources. Because sometimes it's financial, yes, but other times it has to do with your human resources, or even the kinds of materials or tools or other resources that you need to get the project done. For instance, maybe you're suddenly told that the administrative assistant that you were promised is being pulled off the job in order to assist somebody else with a higher priority project. All 3 of these constraints potentially impact on the quality of what you can produce, right? And they impact on one another a lot of times too, almost like dominoes falling. For instance, if the administrative assistant isn't available anymore, you yourself could do all the work, but you might need to have the deadline changed for completing the project. Or you could accommodate a shorter time frame and have the new training produced by February, but you probably are going to need more money to hire a consultant or expand your team somehow. Even expanding the scope of a project could be handled if there were some flexibility in terms of the time that you have available to complete it, or if funding can be increased in order to do the work quickly. So I'm guessing that maybe all this sounds familiar to you. I suspect it does. The question for us as project managers is, what do we do about it? It's inevitable, but how do we cope? Let's look at some ideas for dealing with constraints. Each project is going to be different, and it will have its own mix of constraints. I think it's important to become familiar with the constraints triangle, both because it's very likely to contribute to implementation of your project, but it can also help you to anticipate changes or sometimes even prevent them if you're looking out for what could be unexpectedly happening. For instance, I find the constraints triangle useful in project planning because it makes me be more realistic about the planning that I'm doing. It makes me be cautious about overestimating or underestimating time, cost, or resources needed to accomplish the scope. So try to anticipate the likely constraints that you'll face and try to be realistic in planning so that you don't create constraints yourself for your own project. And then finally, be proactive in response to the emergence of constraints. There are 2 ideas I'd like you to think about a little bit more. One is being able to negotiate once a constraint emerges and things need to be changed. And the other is the importance of transparency. I don't know if you've ever heard, there's an old adage, and it goes like this: fast, cheap, good. You can have any 2 of these. So it can be fast and good, or it can be cheap and good, or it can be fast and cheap, but it excludes the third thing when that happens. So if it's going to be fast and cheap, it may not be good. If it's going to be good and fast, it's probably not going to be cheap. So you get the idea. I think if you get this in your head, you can help your constituents or your funder or your stakeholders sort of educate them on what the ramifications are when constraints emerge that affect either your costs, your timeline, or the resources that you have. In terms of negotiating, you need to be able to explain that you can speed up the project, but that means reducing the scope or dedicating more resources. You can increase the scope by adding people or extending the deadline, or maybe even both. You can complete a project under budget, but you're probably going to have to cut the scope or reduce the number of workers and extend the time it takes to finish. These are the kinds of things in your negotiation that you need to be clear about yourself, but also help other people see clearly. And then transparency. What I mean by this is that I think it's really important to be able to convey these ramifications or these changes from constraints to the stakeholders that you're working with and to your team. So rather than trying to hide them or make up for it or somehow magically succeed despite the constraints, I think having the vocabulary that we're talking about here to discuss those constraints and their impacts on your project is really important. Again, we manage in really complex environments, most of us. Many things can go wrong, and usually something does. And that is exactly why we need to have skilled project managers and team leads working on our projects. Here you see some illustrations of just a few of the challenges that I imagine most of us have had to face at some point. The first one illustrates unrealistic expectations that were not countered at the beginning or were not communicated clearly. For instance, the client or your funder wants a nice stuffed armchair, but they give us the budget for a three-legged stool. The second picture is poor project design, and this occurs in my experience when we forget that the project we're working on is dependent upon and it affects and influences the systems around it. This we call systems thinking, the ability to analyze one element and all of the other factors that are influencing it. I wanted to give you an example here of a project that we were doing. We designed a beautiful training program for nurses in Southern Africa, and one of the nurses said to us, "We continue to go to NICE trainings to get new forms to use that are designed to improve patient quality of care, but everything is impossible to implement. My clinic is understaffed. There are no machines to copy the forms, and it's unclear who the forms are supposed to go to." Another nurse at that same meeting took us outside to see her mobile unit. She drives around her entire district. She sees 25 to 50 patients a day in a tiny little truck with a small camper on the back that is basically her clinic. The wheels all needed to be replaced, largely because the majority of her time is spent on dirt roads that often flood. In fact, flooding had killed 3 people 2 weeks just before the meeting that we were in. So I use this as an example in poor program design of forgetting to think about the realities of the environment in which we're trying to implement a project. The project can be perfectly designed and perfectly justified in terms of need, and yet not be very realistic given the larger issues. The third picture here talks about project delays. You can see this one was delayed right into the winter. In my work experience, this usually occurs when the money hasn't arrived on time, and there's only a certain amount of risk that we're willing to take in terms of starting activities before money arrives. So that's a potential, in some ways, inevitable constraint that we have to deal with. Another picture here shows the result of inadequate resources. There are lots of situations that I've worked in where within a country, the currency of that country is devalued, and suddenly the budget is no longer sufficient to cover the actual costs of implementing the project. I've also worked on projects where fraud resulted in a huge deficit in terms of the amount of money available for the project. Obviously, when any of these things happen, you have to go back to your work plan and back to your constituents with transparency to negotiate a way forward. The fifth picture here is the unrealistic budget. This is a situation where you've often bid too low because you were thinking that was the only way you could win the project or win the bid. I think this is the classic example of shooting ourselves in the foot, where we really want to do a certain type of work or work in a certain place with a certain group of stakeholders, and so we underbid or underestimate what it would take to implement the project. And then finally, the sixth illustration here shows inadequate capacity. Again, without proper analysis ahead of time in the early stages of project planning, we fail to notice that in the systems in which we're working, the larger systems around the project that we're doing, there is simply not enough capacity to sustain the program or sometimes even to implement it. For instance, I've worked on ad campaigns to generate new clients in countries where there just simply were not enough healthcare delivery sites to absorb the clients that we generated. Or I've worked in many situations where we've urged people to go for testing for a particular health issue, and there were not sufficient staff or drugs or sites to provide the services to people who show up. I think many of these things are possible to anticipate if you really spend time in the early stages of project design and project justification to understand what exactly you're doing, where you're doing it, who you're doing it with, what it would take to do it right, and what could go wrong. So to succeed, a project manager really needs to be proactive and decisive in terms of anticipating and managing challenges. I think really often we blame our failures in projects on circumstances out of our control, quote unquote. While this is sometimes true, there are natural disasters and other things that interrupt our plans. Too often, I think we use it as an excuse because we are trying to cover up, even to ourselves, the fact that the risks might have been better anticipated or analyzed or actively managed. To retain control of projects and therefore to promote project success, we as project managers need to develop skills to proactively identify the challenges that are ahead and to effectively manage our projects even when the challenges occur. That is exactly what this course is about.